My name is Mitchell Ash, and I am have the honor to be president of the Israel Study Center Vienna and to moderate this panel today on the topic, The Future is Now, Democracy in Israel. I will say a few words to kind of give a frame to the whole discussion later, but we must, of course, begin with the words of greeting. And the best person to do that is the Vice Rector of this House, Gesandte Magistra Martina Schubert, wenn man das richtig ausspricht. Bitte schön, ich bitte Sie um Ihr Grußwort.
Good evening, dear moderator, Mr. Mitchell Ash, and Professor of Modern History at the University of Vienna and President of the Center for Israel Studies in Vienna. Good evening. Yes, I would like to welcome you all, dear participants, moderator, and distinguished panelists to this evening tonight. I am Martina Schubert, as already said. I'm here, the Deputy Director, now already for several months. And I'm very happy to welcome you at tonight's panel's discussion. The future is now democracy in Israel. I suppose that the moderator will introduce the panelists later on, so I would just like to welcome also the chairperson of the Friends of the New Israel Fund, Austria, Dr. Eleonore Lappin-Eppel. Good evening. I would like just to speak and tell you a little bit about our activities here at the Diplomatic Academy linked to Israel and inform you a little bit about our program as well. We offer, as you might know, 3 master programs at our school, Vienna School of International Studies, as we say it in English, but it's very much known as Diplomatische Akademie Wien. It's the Master in Advanced International Affairs, the Masters in Environmental Affairs and International Affairs, and a new Master's from September onwards in Digital International Affairs. Why do I say that? Is because in our programs we offer also regular courses about Israel and the Middle East. So, for example, we have the honor to have the former Speaker of the Knesset and interim President of Israel, Avraham Burg, who teaches as visiting professor at our school since 10 years now, since 2013. The cooperation with the academic institutions in Israel has deepened in the last years. Since 2017, we have every year student exchanges with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And last year also, we had a joint course on European science diplomacy, which has taken place at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and at which our students could participate online. Every year, a visiting professor from the Israel Institute comes to teach here for several weeks at our school. This year it was the president of the Israel Institute, Itamar Rabinovich. Since 2022, we organize also regularly, we also organize yearly, not regularly, but yearly, every year, student trips to Israel. Such a student trip will again take place this summer. And of course, we welcome very regularly visitor groups here at our Diplomatische Akademie from Israel. So, for example, last November, we had the visit of the National Defense College of Israel, or this year, a student group from the Ben Gurion University visiting us. And of course, many, many conferences take place here with reference to Israel. I just say it in a larger topic. So we come to the topic of tonight's talk, in fact, democracy in Israel. This is of particular importance. Over the past few months, Israelis from across the social and political spectrum, be it labor unions, army reservists, diplomats, health workers, students, have filled the streets to deliver a full-throated rejection of Mr. Netanyahu's plan to remove almost all legal restraints on his government. So far, and I quote here a recent New York Times article, Mr. Netanyahu has done no more than to put the judicial overhaul, which would effectively neuter the independence of the judiciary by allowing a majority in parliament to overrule Supreme Court rulings, on hold until after the parliament's Passover break. The question now is, what will happen after this date? Some argue that the danger to the future of democracy in Israel is far from over. I'm sure that the distinguished panelists of tonight's talk will give us a good insight on the social and political background of this crisis and on the future of democracy in Israel. I look forward personally to the discussion and wish us all an interesting evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Rector. We have a second sponsor who is also prepared to give us a word of greeting, and that is Eleonora Lapin. She's already been introduced. So, Noli, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking here as the representative of the New Israel Fund in Austria. The New Israel Fund is an international organization that raises money for the Israeli civil society. We support NGOs that struggle for democracy, civil and human rights, equality, social justice, and Jewish-Arab partnership. We are proud that B'Tselem, represented today by Orly Neu, is among our grantees. The New Israel Fund does not only distribute money. We also established Shatil, an Israeli organization that offers training, capacity building for our grantees to help and increase their impact. Our staff members also engage in advocacy for our aims in the Knesset, the Judiciary, and with other decision makers. That Israel today has a vibrant civil society is also thanks to our work. The election results of last fall that brought the current Israeli government into power horrified and shocked us. However, we were not surprised. For years, we have been warning that there can't be democracy and occupation. The disenfranchisement and oppression of millions of Palestinians must have a detrimental effect also on Israeli democracy. Therefore, we demand an end to the occupation and advocate, or prefer, the two-state solution. That the current government, with its far-right extremist members and even ministers, was elected with a comfortable majority proves to us how right we were. It shows the erosion of democratic values. I am sure we will hear more about this from our distinguished panelists. Therefore, the New Israel Fund supports the pro-democracy movement and the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who recognize the value of democracy, of a functioning, independent judiciary, of checks and balances in politics. Many Jews in the diaspora joined the struggle. In Vienna, so far, we had 2 solidarity demonstrations with democracy in Israel. For us in the diaspora, it is also important that Israel is and remains a democracy. In Israel, many of our NGOs are in the vanguard of this movement. At the demonstrations, some of our grantees and all our staff members still propagate the old message that there can't be democracy and occupation. We are yet a minority of the big democracy movement, but our message is there. Nevertheless, we support the pro-democracy movement wholeheartedly and also generously with our emergency funds. I would like to thank our partners, the Center for Israel Studies and the Kreisky Forum, as well as our partner and host, the Vienna School of International Studies. I wish you, ladies and gentlemen, a thought-provoking evening.
That was a statement about the order of the discussion that was about to follow. But first, a few words for myself, as I had already indicated, to frame the issues. As is well known, Israel has no written constitution. Does that matter? The Constitution of the United States, which is often presented as a model for the world, does not contain the word democracy. It still does not today. The Austrians in the room might be surprised to learn that the word democracy is also absent from the Austrian constitution. Austria's constitutional law, Verfassungsgesetz, begins with Hans Kelsen's simple but powerful formula: Austria is a democratic republic. All power derives from the people. Democracy, republic, same thing? That's one of the things we would be discussing this evening. All power derives from the people is clearly a central principle of democracy. The question has always been, how does this happen? How do you make a state on the basis of that principle? And there are probably as many answers to that as there are states, and maybe a few more. By that definition, Israel would, of course, also be a democratic republic if it had a constitution. Such a constitution was promised in the Declaration of Independence of 14th of May 1948, but a constitutional convention has never been called. Nonetheless, until now, a consensus appeared to be in place that democracy in Israel, as in other states, consisted of particular institutions: the executive, parliament, the Knesset, and the judiciary, established and protected by law, each of which should be in relative balance with the others. That is the principle of separation of powers, which is enshrined in the American Constitution. The independence of the judiciary is currently guaranteed by a law governing appointments to be made by a commission, and not by the Knesset. The reform of the judiciary proposed by the current coalition government, as we have just heard, aims to shift the balance in favor of the Knesset, because it would then be able to appoint judges to the court first, not only, that's the main thing, actually, and also to nullify its rulings by simple majority vote thereafter. Prime Minister Netanyahu has dropped hints after the protests began that the needed majority might be raised, say, to 65 rather than 61 of the 120 members of the Knesset. Others would probably say that if you're going to do that, you might as well make it a two-thirds majority if you want to overrule decisions of the Supreme Court, but no one is proposing that at the moment, as far as I know. The principle remains that the Knesset could overrule high court rulings, and that would be the same regardless of what that majority might be. Hundreds of thousands of protesters see this proposal as a threat to minority rights and even the rule of law, and thus an existential threat to Israeli democracy itself. They oppose the coalition's move to equate democracy with majority rule, and to exploit their current narrow advantage in the Knesset to enact radical change. I quote, just for fun, perhaps, statements made on comment pages in America after Donald Trump's election: "We won, get used to it." Clearly, they advocate a different concept of democracy from the one embodied in the current coalition's proposals. So we have at least two concepts of democracy out there in the discussion, and there are more. Many protesters worry that the proposed judicial reform is only a first step. They note that the current government has already presented a long list of additional laws, among them laws to extend the exemption of religious people, mainly males, from military service beyond what already exists. But there are many others, about 120 such laws that are out there on the list, so I can't go into them all. But the point is that it's not just about the reform of the judiciary. So the danger of an illiberal democracy in the mode of Viktor Orban, or as some say, a theocracy with decision-making power in the hands of the chief rabbi or ultra-Orthodox politicians, is what worries the protesters. But there is still more to the problem than that. Especially in Israel, the central question is not only democracy how, but also democracy for whom. Posters and stickers at protest demonstrations say, for example, democracy and occupation cannot coexist. We've heard this stated by Norli Lapin in her introductory remarks. The protest leadership permits such posters, but deliberately downplays this aspect of the debate, hoping to continue to attract protesters from the right and even some Orthodox protesters, as they have been successfully doing so far. So the word democracy is a very effective slogan for bringing in many different groups who think of democracy different ways, but do not have to explain the differences in order to participate in the protests. One of our panelists put the more radical position slightly differently in an article published yesterday with the title, "No True Democracy Without the Palestinians." By this, she plainly means both the Arabs, and who are not only Palestinians, already living on Israeli territory, who already enjoy citizenship rights, including the right to vote, and also those in the occupied territories, as we've just heard, who as yet do not have such rights. The question implicitly addressed here is already present in Kelsen's formulation. All power derives from the people, he wrote. Which people is the question. Who is the people? Israel is defined as a Jewish state and also as a democracy. Can it be both at the same time? And if so, what kind of democracy would it be? Or should it be? The question has been asked many times. It has not been raised for the first time now. It's been there for decades, but has not been resolved. The current political crisis makes the issue more urgent than before. So our panel will address two issues this evening. First, the social and political background of the current crisis. Are the protests the last hurrah of a secular Israel that has dominated politics and culture for the past 75 years, but has failed at the ballot box and is doomed to eventual defeat at the hands of an ultra-Orthodox soon-to-be majority, some will say in 10 years, as some analysts have claimed? First question. Second question is what I've already asked: what does democracy mean in Israel? The call to defend democracy has been very effective to mobilize protests, but what is it exactly that the protesters are defending? Perhaps it was best to leave the word undefined in order to mobilize as many people as possible in the protests, but I'm sorry to say that that will not work for very long. The protests, one could imagine at least, open up a possibility of rethinking the concept of democracy in Israel in ways going beyond the idea of separation of powers and human rights and the like, which are common to democracies all over the world, and to reimagine the concept of the people in Israel. And perhaps not. That's the second question for our panel. Our panelists are well equipped to address these issues from different points of view. Natan Snyder, Professor of Emeritus of Sociology, Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo, School of Politics and Society, is currently a Senior Fellow at the International Research Center for Cultural Studies, IFK, in Vienna, and has published widely on politics in Israel, but also on the politics of memory in the German-speaking world. His most recent book on that field is well known for many of us, Fluchtpunkte der Erinnerung, published last year. Orly Noy is chair of the executive board of B'Tselem in Jerusalem, an activist and widely published author, most recently of a paper, Do Israeli Protesters Really Want Democracy?, published at the end of March, and we'll be talking about what she means by that on this panel. Sagi Barmak is director of the Adam Smith Center for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the author of commentaries on contemporary Israeli politics, but he's mainly an expert in the history of American conservative political thought. So he represents a third point of view for our panel. The word diversity is something we take seriously at the Israel Studies Center. And I'm now going to ask all three of the panelists to come to front. I'm going to ask each of the panelists a deliberately pointed question in order to begin the discussion. And they can answer that question with an opening statement of their views on the topic. Excuse me, I have to turn this on. Now you can hear me, I hope. They can answer the question any way they like. They can make an opening statement, or they can directly answer my question, whichever, is just to get things started. And then I will try to encourage the panelists to talk with one another, which they probably will start to do even without me. And after a couple of rounds of that, we will, of course, be happy to take questions from you, the audience. And I'm going to do something a bit unusual and start not with the oldest, but with the youngest panelist. Right? And proceed then by the principle of age, but not top down, but bottom up if you want to call it that. Saji, please. You've written an article called Israeli Parliamentarianism Has Failed. It appeared at about the same time that Orly's article on the protesters appeared. As an expert in conservative political thought, I sort of wondered what you wanted to say when you wrote that article. It's not easily found on the net, I'm sorry to say, even though it's in English. So please give us a brief summary.
Right, so first of all, thank you for this kind invitation. Thank you for the co-panelists. So look, for 4 decades, from 1948 till 1995, really the essence of our political system in Israel was the supremacy of parliament, the supremacy of the Knesset, which means that the Knesset got to say the last word in the face of a strong disagreement about values and ends. Now, in the last 3 decades, we are witnessing the erosion of this principle and the rise of new kinds of concept, new kind of democracy, which is based on the principle of judicial supremacy. And probably most of you heard about the constitutional revolution of 1995. Now, we should
actually probably not.
No,
you
yes.
might want to say a word about that.
So during the 90s, our Supreme Court arrogated to himself extreme powers. And so, just to give you an example, right, in the American context, Supreme Court can strike down statutes only based on the articles of the Constitution, right? The court is subordinated to the Constitution itself. In Israel, the court can strike down not only statutes passed by parliament, but recently we learned that the court can strike down and review even the basic laws themselves. So we can get into it later on, but there is no effective check on our Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is an unelected and unaccountable branch of government in Israel. So what we are actually seeing now with the current government is a courageous attempt, in my opinion, to fix a democratic deficit in Israel. And it is not surprising, I mean, this rise of judicial supremacy in Israel. So we are witnessing that the progressive elites in Israel are constantly losing popular support in the public. And it's not, I mean, I'm not surprised that while losing the seats in parliament, they want to empower the Attorney General, the Supreme Court, yes? And while doing so, they are redefining the very meaning of democracy. So democracy, as I understood it, is based on free, fair, equal election. It is a contest on votes, different points of view, different worldview that compete to get power to implement policy for a limited period. But now we are learning in Israel that we need to define a democracy in substantive terms. So they have this concept in Hebrew, demokratia mautit, yes? Substantive democracy, which means progressive democracy. So if there is a wrong majority, God forbid, a conservative majority, which tries to get a conservative policy, we need to somehow circumscribe this majority via this unelected and unaccountable court.
So the failure of parliamentarianism in Israel consists in what exactly?
In the erosion. So the basic conflict now, the basic conflict in Israel now, is who gets to say the final word in face of strong disagreement. Knesset or the Judiciary. The right wants the Knesset to be supreme. This is the logic of the override clause, right? So we probably...
While they have the majority, but would they still want that even if they didn't have the majority?
Yes, I think that yes. So don't forget, this was our basic principle while the Labour Party ruled Israel, right? So we had Mapai for 3 decades, ruled Israel. Nobody ever questioned the supremacy of the Knesset. There wasn't judicial review in Israel. For 4 decades, no one questioned that the court cannot strike down laws of the Knesset. Everybody agreed. It was only after the right wing took power that we see this empowerment of the court.
We do need to remember that there are 3 branches of government, right? So the role of the executive would be what in this concept?
The executive leads public policy in Israel, right? The Knesset passes laws, and the court, don't forget, we don't have a constitution. There is no constitution in Israel. You cannot create out of thin air a constitution. You cannot decide unilaterally that you are empowering one branch of government that you, I don't know why, trusted more than the other branches, yes, just because from some reason you don't trust this current government or this current composition of the Knesset.
So thank you very much for that statement. I think that gives us a lot of material for further discussion down the road.
Hopefully.
Orly Noy is next. And as you have heard, she wrote an essay published at the same time as Sagi's essay, same day, called Do the Protesters Really Want Democracy? So please explain.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, and it's a very interesting discussion. We've just celebrated 75 years of independence, and I think that even for those 75 very dramatic, eventful years, what we are experiencing today in Israel is one of the most dramatic moments in the state's short history. For over 20 weeks, hundreds of thousands of people pouring out of the streets under the slogan of democracy, calling out for democracy. I think that it points out to 2 things, many things, but I will mention 2. One is that there is a very big camp, and I'll just make a side note. Everything that we are discussing here is an inner Jewish discussion, and there is not a single Palestinian citizen around that table, and not around the Israeli public table where this discussion is taking place and not in those demonstrations. And I think that this is something we need to remember. But within that inner Jewish discussion, there is a very big camp, mostly secular, mostly liberal, that maybe for the first time really feels a threat to the definition of Israel as a democracy as understood by this camp. And the second thing is that democracy is still an ethos to a large part of the society. And this is not something to be taken for granted, because right now we have in our coalition people who our Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, very explicitly speaks about his aspiration to establish a theocracy. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister for National Security, is talking about the same thing. So the concept of democracy is not for granted anymore in Israel. So there is still a camp that holds democracy as an ethos. But now the question is what that democracy means. What do they mean when they speak about democracy? And I think that as a society, we've been given a rare opportunity that societies do not often get to actually have that discussion and to pour some content into that concept of democracy. Asking ourselves, how did we get to this point? Yeah, looking at listening to the Israeli public discourse, you might get the feeling that some unidentified flying object just flew from the sky, hit the wonderful Israeli democracy, shifted it from its course, and now we are astonished. What happened to our democracy? We need to have a sincere discussion about how did we get to that place. And of course, the following question would be, so where do we want to go from here? But I think that there is a reason why the current protest movement does not hold that discussion. One answer would be because they want to include as many different fractions and camps as possible, all but the Palestinians, again, the Palestinian citizens. They are just not there, and there is a reason for that. But also, I think that there is a real fear within the Israeli society that once we will start having that discussion, we will very quickly reveal the well-known secret that really the only common value that the Jewish Israeli society shares is Jewish dominance, not to say Jewish supremacy. And that doesn't sit so well with the demand of democracy. So lacking the ability of having that discussion about the content, the substance of democracy, we are focusing on the procedural sides of democracy. What would be the shape of how is the construction of the checks and balances? These are all very important. We cannot have, democracy cannot function without democratic institutions, without the structure. But that cannot be all. And there is a reason why we are not having the completing side of that discussion, because we do not want to give up the Jewish supremacy in order to have true democracy. And I'll just finish with a quick reminder that I'm the chair of B'Tselem. We were the first of the Israeli prominent human rights organization to publish a report declaring Israel or acknowledging Israel to be an apartheid regime in the entire territory between the river and the sea, followed by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, a list of Palestinian human rights organizations. That did not happen under the current Netanyahu's Netanyahu government. So it's not that right now the Israeli democracy just, is starting to shake. We believe that, it hasn't been a democracy for a very long time, if ever.
As put in my introductory remarks, this is a very clear example of how the word democracy can be defined very differently, depending on who's speaking and whom they are speaking about. Okay? But the question I wanted to raise at this point relates to what Noli Lapin said in her word of greeting, that B'Tselem advocates the two-state solution. That is one answer to the question of democracy for whom that I put in my introduction, right? You have a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Now, of course, there would still be Arabs, maybe even Palestinians in the Jewish state, so it doesn't really solve everything to have a two-state solution. But what about, I'm going to put this deliberately, quite provocatively, what about the possibility that the two-state solution has been dead for a very long time, and that we're talking about zombie politics here?
No, I think that if anybody finds that question provocative, they haven't been following the reality. For the two-state solution has been dead for a very long time, and Israel made sure to erase the green line by every possible mean. By the construction of hundreds of new settlements and outposts, illegal outposts in the West Bank, by applying, we do have two systems of law in the occupied Palestinian territories. I don't know of a better definition for apartheid, but there is so the green line for Palestinian, by the way, it exists very much. But I think that your question really takes us back to the fundamentals of the concept of democracy. The Israeli peace camp for many years claimed that the occupation is corrupting the Israeli society, and that mechanisms and conducts from that Israel is conducting in the occupied territories are moving into Israel proper, into the 1948 territories, inside the Green Line, and this is what we are saying now. I think that it's exactly the opposite, and that the organizing logic of it all started in 1948, not in 1967. And the minute you asked in your opening remarks the question of whether or not Israel can be both Jewish and democratic, I think that what we are seeing today is exactly the answer to your question. When you define yourself as a state, as a Jewish and democratic, it means that you will need to artificially engineer demography in such a way that you will always maintain a substantial Jewish majority, so you can be democratic, but also Jewish and democratic by the virtue of your Jewish solid majority. This generated an endless list of discriminatory, racist legislations, practices from the very beginning. Yes, the expropriation of Palestinian land, the citizenship law that prevents Palestinians from marrying spouses, Palestinian spouses from across the Green Line and have them living in the same house with them. The Israel nation state law, of course, that really practically declared the Palestinian citizens as second-class citizens. And the list goes on and on and on. So I think that, if we are being honest, and if we are acknowledging the fact that the two-state solution is simply not there. I live in Jerusalem. You only need to look at what's going on in Jerusalem to understand that. And that the problem does not begin in 1967, but in 1948, I think that, an honest person would draw the conclusion from that equation very simply.
So, thank you. All of you two have given us quite a bit of material for further discussion. And I now turn to Nathan and change the subject a little bit, if he follows and agrees with me in doing so. Nathan, you published a piece in Der Standard a few weeks ago about the conflict in Israel. And if I remember it correctly, it was focused rather more on the secular-religious divide, that on the issue that I mentioned in my introduction, for example, about extending the exemptions from military service to not only to the current Haredim, of the religious people who have it, but also to make it longer, and various other measures of that kind. And I must say, having just been in Israel last week, I can testify that many of the protesters, whom I know at least, do think of this as the central issue, which is different from the issues, these other two, that we've been hearing about. So just to give you an idea of the complexity of it all, Nathan, do you still believe that that's the central issue, or is there more to it?
Well, of course there's more to it, and I don't want to change the subject, with your permission. And that's not exactly the article I wrote, and I don't want to change the subject, with your permission. But I want to continue, basically, the discussion. I also understand the setup of this debate, and I agree with the two of you. And you're both right. And the question is, what are the implications of you're both being right? And I think I'm right too. And I will explain, because the setup of this panel is, of course, and it's very clear. You put a conservative, a radical, and a liberal on one panel, have them go at it, and then let's see what happens. And since I'm really not willing to play on those terms, and because this reminds me of the European Song Contest, and then we're going to collect the points and declare a winner, I want to change a little bit the terms of the debate. And I'm very serious about what I say, that I think you both are right, which means that I have a big problem, of course, with the concept of truth and what means true democracy. And of course, you're right also that the two-state solution has been dead. I mean, it has been clear to almost every Israeli. It's not clear, apparently, outside of Israel, but inside of Israel, nobody actually believes in it anymore. And we need to rethink many of our basic assumptions of how to live together in that common space, and there might be many disagreements about that. But I think that what the three of us may have in common, and very much in common, and I think this is what we need to discuss, that all three of us have a huge stake in this place. And we may have different visions of how to live there, but we all three have a huge stake in this place because we want to live there, and we want our children to live there, and we want to live there without being at each other's throat all the time. So even if we have completely different visions of how democracy could be conceived, we should take this opportunity maybe to discuss what the common denominator is between the three of us, even if we have complete visions. I agree with Oli that the problem is not 1967. It never has been. The problem is 1948. We may disagree about what the problem of 1948 is. I think there's a huge problem of the Palestinian side of accepting the concept of Jewish political, the exercise of Jewish political sovereignty. And this may be one of the major problems. Israel has indeed never been a liberal democracy. It never claimed to be a liberal democracy. But it has been it has never been claimed to be a perfect society. It may be a perfectible society, but not a perfect society. And I take this notion of Israel being a Jewish and democratic state very seriously. You may not, but I take it very seriously. I don't. And people ask, can a state be Jewish and democratic at the same time? Of course it cannot. That's not the issue. The issue is that you have to constantly live in praxis, in a negotiation between these two poles. Now you have like one side of the elected government who wants to abolish the democratic side of that negotiation and wants to make that state extremely Jewish. You have a position that I think might be representing your position, if I understand you right, that you want to abolish the Jewish aspect of that equation and make Israel in a true democracy, in a universal democracy. But Israel was never conceived to be a universal place. Israel is a particular solution to a particular problem. Israel is a creation of history and memory. And I think this should even be made clear when three Israelis are debating this issue in a place like Austria. Because Austria, is part of that equation, what happened and why Israel is a particular solution to a particular problem. Now, you may say that you want the universal solution, but Israel has never claimed to be universal. And that's why I agree with you that the protesters that go out there every week with the Israeli flags they don't really want, as you say, true democracy. You're absolutely right. They don't want that. They don't want true democracy. They want that kind of keeping up the illusion of the negotiation between being Jewish and being democratic. And it's really hard work to keep up an illusion. It's extremely hard work. And it's important work. This is what we have to do if we want to live together there. Because, your position and my position and Sagi's position have to share the same space together with the Palestinians. And I'm also, like you, I'm very sorry that we don't have a fourth panelist who could be a Palestinian, who could add exactly to this thing. But I think that we should really discuss not arguing who is right, because there's not being right. Your position is as right as Sagi's position, as is my position, I think. But we should try to see how we could continue negotiating these terms of the debate, because we don't have a choice. We really don't have a choice. If the major song of the protest movement is, "I don't have another country," then this might sound a little bit kitschy and melancholic, but it's true. And I say this as a Jew. As a Jew, we don't have another country. That's why we need to come to some kind of negotiating terms how we want to live together there. No, don't applaud. This is not a European Song Contest. We don't do applause. This is too serious.
It is.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I do, of course, agree with your refusal to change the subject, because what you have then said was a very interesting point for common discussion. So we have quite a lot of material for common discussion. I do believe, however, that the issue of secular religious nonetheless is important.
No, I can continue talking if you like me to, but I think we should move back to Sagi and Oli again. I don't want to take up all my time.
Using your metaphor, we could probably have had 7 panelists, at the very least, given the different points of view that could be represented in this discussion. So of course you're right. It would have been good to have a Palestinian here as well, but one Palestinian, there are quite a few Palestinian positions too. You may know that on the 4th of June, there's going to be a discussion, Palestinian Voices in Vienna. We're not putting it on, but I just wanted to have mentioned that that's going to happen in the liberal community or Hadash on the 4th of June. So if you want to hear what Palestinians think, that will be a chance to do so.
And I'm going to answer your question in the next time I'm on.
So, each of you has presented very clear positions that may or may not be reconcilable with one another, even though Natan was so clever to say that everybody was right. What do you think, Sachi? Do you think that he's right, that everybody's right?
I would like to comment on Orly. Look, we can have a long discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you will not be surprised that I strongly disagree. So, I mean, from a conservative point of view, you are both radicals. Yes, but look, the issue is the judicial reform, and the reform have nothing to do with the Palestinian issue. I will even say more that there are some issues, mainly foreign affairs, national security, that must be outside of the court's purview. There are issues which cannot be justiciable. This is one of the main faults of our court, making everything justiciable. Okay? This is part of this constitutional revolution beginning in the 80s and the 90s. So if you want to delegitimize even more our Supreme Court in the Israeli society, drag him in this truly and purely political matters. I mean, it's up to the Knesset to decide what to do with Iran, with Hamas in the Gaza Strip, with the Palestinian Authority. Our Supreme Court, it needs to be outside of its purview. And don't forget that tomorrow morning, or 10 years from now, you can have a conservative majority in the court. And then, I think that most of my friends from the left will truly regret their current position. I mean, we need to argue while adopting some kind of a veil of ignorance. You cannot oppose the reform only because you dislike the current coalition. So this is the main issue as to regard to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I will say only briefly one more thing. You cannot delegitimize the democratic procedure only because you are losing the election and only because you are losing popular support. I mean, the democratic contest presupposes strong disagreements about values and public policy and so on. So there is no progressive straitjacket on the democratic procedure, so we need to keep it open.
Just a brief factual statement first, before I ask you a bit about what you just said. If you take the actual votes in the parliamentary election, I don't mean the parliamentary seats now, I mean the votes, the two sides are separated by a total of less than 40,000 votes. Yes? So equating the winners with the people is perhaps a bit strong.
No, exactly. So in the next election, if the government is not popular, the left could build a coalition. I will say more than this. So the left need to decide. I mean, I understand that they don't like Netanyahu. Okay, so guess what? Netanyahu is going with the far right. So there are political alternatives that we need to stand behind them. I mean, this is the political game.
One of the questions that you are implicitly raising is something that we might also want to discuss in this concept, although it really is not directly related to the issue of democracy per se, is the collapse of the left. Which is perhaps the most important phenomenon of the most recent parliamentary elections. The left parties are barely exist now in the Israeli. Mapai, you mentioned what,
Okay, so in the
Right.
the last elections,
4 seats.
the two extreme left parties, Balad and Meretz, didn't pass the threshold. The Labour Party barely passed the threshold, got only 4 seats in the government.
Right.
Do you surprised that they want to empower our Supreme Court?
We could go into detail, but probably should not, about what lay behind all of that. That gets into very, very, shall we say, detailed waters. But I wanted to have at least mentioned that these things are part of the equation. I do wonder, Wally, if you, to go back to the question we began with in the first round, leaving aside the question of apartheid, which could also lead us into troubled waters for a lot of reasons, are you advocating citizenship rights, unalloyed citizenship rights for everyone in the territories? Is that the position you take? That would be the one-state solution.
Yeah, not necessarily, and certainly, I mean, since I'm wearing different hats, as B'Tselem, we don't have a political stand. We are just lobbying for stopping the violation of human rights. I think it's not either or. There are other solutions. There are very interesting ideas of a confederation with 2 nation states, with some sort of an arrangement similar to the EU, some sort of confederation. If there is a will, there is a way. I don't think that there is a will. But with your permission, 2 comments about what Nathan said and what Sagi. I understand I immigrated myself to Israel at the age of 9 from Iran. I can understand, I relate to this urge, this need for a Jewish state. But one thing is that Israel today is furthest away from any Jewish value that I know. So there's really nothing Jewish right now about Israel other than Jewish supremacy and oppressing other people in the name of that supremacy. I don't think that it serves this safe haven that it was supposed to. We are no less under threat. I live in Jerusalem. I've been experiencing that for a long time. And the second thing is that full, substantial democracy is not abolishing the Jewish national identity of the Jewish national collective in Israel. The state for all its citizens that Balad has been suggesting, the Palestinian Democratic National Party, which I'm a part of, has been suggesting for many years, has 2 layers to it. One is full equal citizenship. That means dismantling all the institutional bodies that aim to preserve Jewish supremacy, such as the Jewish National Fund, Jewish Agency, etc., all the discriminatory legislations, so that on the civil level, we all citizens of the same state, and we should all be treated like that. But there is another layer, and this is acknowledging both national collectives living in that state. So acknowledging the Jewish Israeli nationality, Jewish Israeli, not Jews around the world. I think that the fact that I had more rights in Israel as a 9-year-old, even before I set foot in the state, than a Palestinian family that has been living there for generations is not right. But there is a Jewish Israeli collective and should be acknowledged as such, and there is a Palestinian Israeli collective and should be acknowledged as such. And I'm talking about, it's not a solution for the conflict, I'm talking only about Israel within the 1948 boundaries. And one remark about, Sagi, you mentioned that this judicial coup or reform has nothing to do with Palestinians. I find it very, I mean, I think it's a very strange thing to say, because due to the supremacist practices of Israel, although the Supreme Court, and it should be said, legitimized almost every crime that Israel committed in the West, has been committing in the West Bank, all the administrative detentions, all the ethnic cleansings, it approved everything. But for the Palestinian citizens, it still serves as a last resort for protecting some of their individual rights. Without that very thin shield that is still protecting somehow the individual rights of Palestinian citizens, you are talking about, I mean, anything can happen. So to say that this reform has nothing to do...
What part in the reform would deny access to the courts?
I said the procedure. We are very good with procedural democracy. They will have access to the court. Okay. But with a court that is a political branch of the Knesset, and without the court being able to monitor the legislation being done by the Knesset, the Palestinian citizens will be totally and completely exposed. So you cannot say that this reform has nothing to do with Palestinians.
Can I comment?
Yes, please.
Look, the reform is very modest, in my opinion. Why? Because we recognize that the court took to himself the right to review laws. But today, the law says nothing about the procedure. So you can strike down the statute of the Knesset with the majority of 2 versus 1 in the court. So we want to regulate this. And I think that the court, if he decided to strike down statutes, needs to have a supermajority of a kind. So the current proposal is 2/3, 10 out of 15 judges. So, you cannot just expect the court to, to embody, in its opinion, your personal views, right? So, we need to be very careful of masquerading policy conflict as the rights discourse, right? So there is no rights, human rights in the abstract, tell us nothing in the abstract. There is no agreement in Israel what kind of rights should be outside the purview of the Knesset. There is legitimate conflict about what should happen with Judea and Samaria, and you cannot expect the court. I mean, you are presupposing that there will always be progressive judges in the court, yeah, that will save your policy worldview. I mean, it's the wrong political way to change the current situation in Israel.
Do you want to comment?
We can continue that.
I think I want to ask Natan if he has another comment to make on this or something else.
Oh, I have many comments on many things.
Go for it.
To make. I can see Sagi's point about the courts and the shifting of balance, that the moment a certain political environment lost political power, it was shifting its hopes to the courts to save the day. And sometimes the courts did. When you were Palestinians, the courts did not. But it was part of what I said before, of keeping up the illusion of us living in in a state that is extremely torn, complicated, in going where religion is taken completely seriously. I mean, I would argue even there is no such thing, there cannot be such thing as secular Zionism. I mean, it's a contradiction in terms. Even those, what is a secular Zionist? A secular Zionist says, you know, I'm living in a country that was promised to me by God I don't believe in, and has to live with that contradiction. And Israel has never been a true secular project. I mean, otherwise it could have been in Uganda, it could have been in another place. The Jews came back to the old country because of religion. It reestablished the holy language, the way that we could have that debate now without any problem in Hebrew, using sort of like sacred language to talk about secular politics in many ways. So this is all extremely complicated, and of course you talked about the decline of left parties. Left parties have not declined; they have moved to the right, and what was before the old Labour Party is now the other parties that are to the right of Labour Party. And it's interesting. I mean, this is also what we need to talk about. That two parties, Meretz and Balad, both proposing universal solutions to particular problems, have not made it into parliament. So we need to take into account, you need to take into account, I think, if you want to, you don't have to, of course, that a vast majority of Jewish Israelis don't want to give up, just don't want to give it up. That kind of thinking that Israel is Jewish and democratic at the same time, that there should be a Jewish majority, that Israel in that sense is not a true democracy by any normative definition of what democracy should be, but that Israel is an ethnic democracy. And some people would even say it's not even an ethnic democracy, it's an ethnocracy. It depends really where you stand politically. But I think, and this is what, I mean, this is also the reason, and you have written about this, why the protest movement comes to these demonstrations with the Israeli flag. It's a patriotic, conservative revolution because they recognize in the other side a kind of messianic revolutionary movement that is scaring and frightening. I mean, Mitch talked about before about, that there's a certain milieu in Israel that feels threatened, and I belong to this environment which feels threatened by this kind of revolutionary zeal by the other side. So yes, we come to this demonstration with an Israeli flag because we are conservatives. We want things to go back. We want things to go back to a certain way. And this is why at these demonstrations, there are people you wouldn't be caught dead with in the same demonstrations. People like Lieberman, people like, other people from what is called in Israel the soft right. You probably don't accept that concept of that there is such a thing as a soft right.
Meretz is soft right.
Then you see if Meretz is soft right for you. I mean, then really? Of course, then you put yourself in a position, and I don't want to speak in what you shouldn't think, but you put yourself in a position where you very right. You're right. You're completely right. You're sitting on a position of more righteousness, and there's nothing I can say about this. You're absolutely right. But what are the implications of that? What are you going to do with your being right if you look back and there's nobody there who follows you in your being right. You know, you have to make politics with people, not with concepts. And politics is the art of limitation. What can we actually do? And this is why, as for instance, as being part of a human rights organization, we are there at the demonstrations where you are not, because you sort of like are almost against these demonstrations. We are there at these demonstrations in order, not because of, but one of the unintended consequences, if we are going to succeed, is that you can continue your work within a human rights organization, because if they're going to have their way, your organization is going to be outlawed.
Yeah, I know that.
And this, I'm not saying we are fighting for B'Tselem to have, you know, to continue fighting, but this is one of the unintended consequences of our success, which is also going to be your success in a very limited way, because it's not going to be the huge messianic utopia of we all going to live together in as Palestinians and Jews in a free and equal society. Who would not want that? I also want that. It's a wonderful illusion. But I rather keep up my illusion, which I think is more practical.
I think that you both need to get to know more right-wing Israelis.
Oh, my entire
we
family.
We don't want a theocracy. We don't want to ruin Israel. We want to advance conservative public policy.
I was a college teacher. I taught students, so I know what right-wingers are.
Can I advance to that very quickly?
We need to. The crosstalk is great. It shows that the passion, but the audience needs to hear what you're saying. So, please respond. Yes, we're going to come to the public very soon.
First, it's true, I do have my moral standards, and I do not intend to compromise. And if I need to apologize for that, I will.
No, never do.
No, but I want to say a word about your way of pragmatism, what you conceive as pragmatism. Because we've been there already. We've been there only 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I don't know how many of the audience remember, we've had very similar situation in which week after week, tens of thousands of people protested against Netanyahu. That was because of the corruption, whatever, but the slogans were the same. It was democracy, democracy, democracy. And it was, exactly like today, the protesters knew very well what they didn't want. As today, they didn't take the time to articulate what it is that they do want. So they got what they didn't want. Yes, they got rid of Netanyahu. In that way, the Balfour protest was very successful. But then what did we get instead of that? We get a very peculiar coalition of a combination between Bennett, Lieberman, Meretz, Labour Party, no common denominator, nothing in common.
The best experiment in Israeli politics ever.
But just wait.
And Ram, don't forget Ram.
And Ram. But what happened to that government, and I think that this is the true lesson. First, I should say, and I'm sorry being the sort of the Palestinian of that panel, but since there isn't, I will take that position. It was the deadliest government against Palestinians since 2 decades. It doubled the number of house demolitions in East Jerusalem. It was a horrifying government to Palestinians in every single way, a government in which people like Gabi Lasky, who represented as a lawyer most of my friends who got arrested from Meretz, Mossi Raz, who is a long-time fighter against the occupation, they were part of the coalition that was the deadliest against the Palestinians in 2 decades. And even more revealing than that, what was the end? How did this government come to an end? Do you remember? brought itself down, it dispersed itself to maintain the apartheid laws in the West Bank. They were those regulations that maintained the apartheid situation in the West Bank with two different legal systems were about to expire. Netanyahu's bloc said, we won't vote to save you, and we will not vote for their renewal, as opposed to their ideological stand, but they didn't want to save that coalition. So they dispersed themselves in order to save the apartheid regime in the West Bank. This is the result of being too pragmatic. You end up with that kind of government that cannot promote any real policy and that breaks itself up on the altar of the apartheid regime in the West Bank. Why would I see it as a pragmatic thing?
One point that's you're making implicitly is that a coalition with 7 parties is inherently unstable. And it was predicted from the very beginning that it would not last very long, and it didn't. Because there were so many possibilities for someone to simply say, I'm not doing this anymore. But that's completely independent of any ideological position. That's just the inherent instability of coalitions of that size. So my question would be about the current coalition. It's fewer parties, but still appears to me at least to be inherently unstable. So that would be something we could also talk about. You know, this is a frightening moment, as Natan said, for a very large segment of Israeli society, but perhaps it will go away anyway because the two radical right parties won't understand that this is really their only chance, or do they understand that?
So in Israeli history, only 2 governments succeeded in finishing 4-year terms. So just prior the last judicial reform, the consensus among the left and the right was that Israel is undergoing a governability crisis. Yes, we had 7 elections in 10 years. So governments in Israel, listen, are extremely weak. As we speak now, there is a general strike in Israel launched by different mayors because of a very conservative tax reform initiated by the Treasury Minister Smotrich. And there is a consensus that the government will have to compromise. Yes, and this is only a conservative tax reform. So I find the opponents to the reform very confused. So on the one hand, they warn us against the tyranny of the majority. On the other hand, they complain there is an outcry in Israel about the excessive powers of minorities, especially the Haredi Jews. Yes, so the focus now of the protest is the draft exemption and the budgetary transfers to the Haredi Jews. So you can blame the government simultaneously of promoting the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the minority. So in my opinion, we have a serious, you cannot, now after the protest, you cannot govern Israel anymore. Don't kid yourself. The next left government that will try to evacuate Jews from settlements, the right will disobey. Because we learned from the left how you can stop legitimate government from initiating policy.
I agree.
On that note, I think it's time now to finally come to the audience and ask for questions. Yes, please. Noli has kindly consented to bring the microphone over to you. It's possible to speak in this room and be understood, but it's better with the mic, I think.
I have 2 brief questions. One to Mr. Bamak. You said that maybe in a short time the Orthodox Jews are the majority in Israel. What I want to know is, in your system, which rights do the minorities have? Also, do you have, for example, in Austria, we have the rights to evoke Untersuchungsausschuss, so, and I don't know that in English, we have the right to evoke special parliamentarian procedures who investigate special things. Sorry, I can't say it better. So which rights do the minorities have in your system? And to you, Ms. Neu, you say the Supreme Court shall monitor the laws, and as far as I understood it, you do not have constitutional law, so against what do they monitor?
Oh, thank you for that question. So, look, even the most minimalist definition of democracy presupposes some kind of political liberties, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, some right to private property, a freedom to petition, and so on and so on. Yes. So this is basic democratic liberties. Now, if you want to expand the list of rights, you need to convince the Israeli people, to enact a constitution and enact a Bill of Rights. But in order to do it, you need to convince a supermajority that will restrain a temporal or a small majority. So this is the logic of a constitutional regime. But we don't have any constitution in Israel. So you cannot just petition to the court because you don't like some kind of policy. Just to give you an example, so economically, I'm a libertarian, right? But I don't think that my fellow from the left would like a conservative court that will strike down socialist policies in the name of the right for private property. I will be glad, yes, but I don't think that they will agree. So there is a strong disagreement. Don't buy this masquerading of policy into a rights discourse. There is no agreement about what rights we should have.
And to your question, it's true, we don't have a constitution, but there is a list of what we call basic laws that eventually should accumulate into a constitution whenever that will happen. But there is a base, like there are stronger laws than in ordinary, and so that would be the, when it comes to the Supreme Court, that would be the guideline.
There is no agreement about the meaning, yes, of human dignity. Yeah. I mean, what is human dignity?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm a sociologist. I came to be interested in Israel in a study on inequality around the world in relation to ethnic differentiation. And I found that inequality has increased most in Israel, all over the world, since 1950, related to increasing ethnic differentiation. I would like to make 3 short points. First, Israel must be a Jewish state, Mr. Snyder argued. I think Israel has the same defect, the Constitution, as the American Constitution, the American Constitution did not provide equality to the black Americans. And equality is a central element of democracy. And George Mason, one of the authors of the Constitution, did not sign it because of that. And he was highly discriminated against.
That changed.
We can
that
say,
changed 100 years
now
ago.
it's changed, yes. We see a general trend in the world that the ethnic definition of state disappears. Germany has changed the constitution, how to can become a German citizen, not only by being the son of a German. In England, you have a premier who is not English origin, and so on. In most countries, there are a few countries, interestingly also Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are based on an ethnic definition. It's religion in the main regard in those cases, and I think in Israel it's the same. So I think that's the first point. The second point is related to Professor Ash's question, which has not been answered, that this discussion about the importance of the judiciary and the parliament, Knesset, not to mention was the government. I think the government is the most important instance in Israel, and the lack of a constitution helps that. The most important decisions were the wars which Israel has led. They were not declared by the Knesset. They were declared by the government, the premier. The same happens in America. Third point, the last point. Yesterday I read that Ben-Gurion has said, if you are a realist in Israel, you must be an idealist. You must have visions. And I think that's true still today. If Israel had a very democratic constitution, as Oli Neub has it in mind, and I too, then the main problems that Israel has now would disappear. The one is the internal terrorism by the Palestinians, and the other is the threat from outside, from the Arab and from Iran and so on. So I think a vision which goes quite over the realism now is very important. Thank you.
The statement you quoted is usually attributed to Ben-Gurion, and he said, he said, if you believe in miracles, you're a realist in Israel, which is, of course, also a play on Herzl's famous statement. Yes, if you want it, it's not a fairy tale. So we have two people from here. All right, go on. It's not true, but never mind.
Nina Tannenwald. I'm an American international relations professor. So my question is, there's a theory in international relations called diffusion theory, which very simply says that states, one of the things it says, that states in a region come to look more like each other. That is because ideas and practices diffuse across borders. Applied to Israel, in the Middle East, it would say that Israel would come to look more like its neighbors in the Middle East. And it seems that the evidence is going in that direction, that basically Israel is going to become a religious nationalist state. And there's lots of evidence, and those are the trend lines, in which case it will come to look more like Iran, which it will, a country with ethnic supremacy. It will be an illiberal, a very illiberal democracy. The trends are all pointing in that direction. I wonder what you think about that.
Are you asking me?
You first, but anyway.
Oh, I'm sorry. First, well, I think that Israel's relations with the surrounding neighbors and the environment of the Middle Eastern environment are an incredibly complicated topic for, I think, maybe another discussion. But I think that this Israel's self-notion in the area was articulated very clearly by former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who described Israel as a villa in the jungle. So I think if you see yourself as a villa in the jungle, and by the way, that goes also to the question of ethnicity in Israel and ethnic hierarchies in Israel, that also drive from the same logic of seeing this colonial gaze of yourself as a villa in the jungle and what it means about how high of walls you need to protect yourself. So, and also it should and this is my Iranian patriot self, that also what you see in many of the Middle Eastern countries, especially in Iran, are not, there is nothing inherent about the nature of those countries that brought Iran, for example, to it's an immediate outcome of American and British intervention in 1953. And had they left us alone, the Brits and the Americans, we would have had in Iran today the great democracy that Mossadegh wanted to establish back then. And I think that many of those Western interventions are also stirring in the current Israeli situation. So there's nothing inherent about, that diffusion theory. It's international, we are part of the international scene. It's not...
Sagi.
I strongly disagree. Israel is becoming more liberal, more open, more tolerant. If you compare Israel 20, 30, 40 years ago, it's a much better place by every definition that you choose. We are an optimistic people. We are a strong nation. We believe in the future. And we have a strong tech sector. We have a strong family values, a strong attachment to tradition. I think that Israel is really the most successful example of a democratic nation state in the West.
But it's not becoming more liberal.
I disagree. I strongly disagree.
If I may, just before the next person speaks, I'm really quite astonished by your formulation of this theory, because the one structure that all the other states in the region have in common is the predominant power of the secret police. And I don't see that in Israel. And I don't see
You don't see that
it's
in Israel?
happening, but
See
it's
that
not
in
that
Israel?
it's
You
not.
don't see that in
They're
Israel?
important and they're strong, but they don't run the whole country.
Yeah, I disagree.
I mean, I should just add that this theory would also predict that a country like Iran would evolve in Israel's direction or in a more liberal direction, right? There would be some convergence toward some consensus or some convergence position, right? So it's not just one country.
But by storming the capital, I mean, the United States looks like what kind of country? There is no equivalent in Israel. There is no violence in Israel. I mean, look what happens in what? No. Look, I strongly disagree with this whole framework of. I mean, we can have the discussion about the Palestinian conflict. It has nothing to do with the current reform. Nothing whatsoever. It's a total different argument.
We need to ask more people to...
Mitch, you left me out.
Yes, I'm
in the
sorry,
round.
Natan.
Yeah.
Please, I didn't realize
I mean,
you wanted to say something. You didn't say anything. Please,
No,
go right ahead.
I
Go
mean,
for
it's
it.
like,
Please.
I particularly love it when Austrians tell me to give up the Jewish character of the state. And what happens if it doesn't work? You know, it's like the stake is ours. You know, this is our problem, not yours. So, about your point, you're right and you're wrong. And that's why I also agree with the two of them. You're right and you're wrong. There is, of course, an approximation of the Israeli state towards the states in the Middle East, no doubt. But Israeli society, while Sergei mentioned before that government is weak, but Israeli societies, not Israeli societies, Israeli societies are extremely strong, extremely diverse, extremely pluralistic, liberal, illiberal, conservative, reactionary, everything. You have homophobes and you have open homosexuality. You have a hip movement. You have a completely conservative and reactionary movement. There's this kind of diversity that you won't find in many of the other neighboring societies, which has to do, by the way, that it's a country that has to sort of like absorb, you know, immigrants from Iran and immigrants from Germany in the same space.
And from Russia.
And from Russia, and from Russia. And with those different kinds of political views that we have, that we can discuss in English in a foreign country. That doesn't need to be downplayed. This is an extremely important point, and I would like to go back to my first intervention, which is we three have a stake in this place, and we three have to live there as we want our children and grandchildren to live there, because we don't have another place, because you won't go back to Russia, and you won't go back to Iran, and I definitely won't go back to Germany. And so, and that's why we certainly need to somehow get it together with the non-Jewish population, of course, together with the non-Jewish populations, and we need to constantly renegotiate what the meaning of democracy is, what the meaning of living together is, without falling in the trap of normative decisions, what true democracy is, what democracy should be, because this is more of a trap than it is a kind of political way.
That would be a brilliant concluding statement, but I have four other people, now five if I count you, sir.
I just wonder, I agree with Nathan very much, but one thing I wonder that nobody is considering what is around Israel and all the
enemies of Israel, they take advantage of it. If they come from all sides, even Lebanon, which is so weak and had so many troubles, and it's all, so I am very often in Israel, and I see the change in Israel. The people became not the same opening that it used to be. Everybody is only very close to the neighborhood and only in his part. So it's a big change in Israel now going on. It's of course also Corona and the financials, the economy. I heard that many people are going away. I know some friends told me that. And as friends told me that so many people want to leave the country, even the one who are experienced, the high-tech people, and so that's very bothering, I think. And with the election, it's only in the 3 years it has been 5 elections. I mean, this was, it's not that all the time the election, that concentrated in the last 5 years, 3 years.
We need to try to pull some of this together and let the panelists then respond after that. If we see if this will work, please go on ahead.
Yes, it's interesting to sit here and hear so many different views, and everybody is right. It's a little bit difficult to understand because I think the main concern of the demonstrators, and it's my concern too, is that if the reform goes through, it will not happen, as you said, Sagi, that the next government will be the other side and they will govern, and then it will be a pendulum, and then will be another one. It's the danger of dismantling of a liberal democracy into an autocratic state or a dictatorship, which will be possible because it's so easy to do. The first thing the new government has to do now, after the reform, is to say that the Arab parties are not legitimate to go to vote. And it can be very easily done. We have seen in the 20th century how easily democracy can be dismantled. And I would like to hear from you if you're not afraid about that. And this leads me to the second question. I didn't really understand where is your stand, each of you, on the point of check and balances. Because you said, yes, we need check and balances, but you see it completely differently. So it would be interesting to hear.
This would be great for all of everyone to respond immediately, but we're running out of time. So Doron is next, please.
Yes, I think that one of the striking features of this discussion, which is very Israeli, is that we are not discussing it as if it is a global discussion, because there is a concept of democracy, and it's not only the rule of majority. Never, in no place since Voltaire, they speak about the separation of powers, and they speak about the right of minorities. And if you don't have that, you can call it something else, which maybe should be oligarchism or something, but it's not what is meant internationally when you speak about democracy. But I also think that the question, what is true democracy, is something that I hear it not only in Israel, but I think we have this title, the future is now. I don't believe that the future is now. I think democracy is not a constitution alone. It's not a state. It's a procedure and something that develops all the time. So if people go to the streets to defend democracy, for instance, in France in the 30s, and there was the Popular Front government, they defended it against fascism. They fought for a colonialist, racist France. But luckily, they defended democracy. The same applies to the United States. It was not equality. They fought Nazis, but it was not equality for the African Americans. Luckily, they fought. And the same applies for Great Britain. And when we went to the streets in the year 2000 in Austria, a lot of people, not a lot of people, some left groups said to us that the Social Democrats were also racist to the migrants. What do we care about the Freedom Party? But we were fond and proud to care that they are not in the coalition and to fight against this coalition. And I think that if we see that, I'm very fond that in Israel people defend something that is democratic, because I think that in this development, in this protest movement, questions come up that go beyond the question if you have a Supreme Court or not. And by the way, as was said before, it's a very easy thing to change democracy when it is only the rule of majority. All you have to do is to say that this is the last election for certain parties because they're not loyal to the state. And it's already proposed. It's already on the table. They already say it openly. So what we see in Israel, and that is not only an Israeli discussion, it's a discussion that we have in Europe. We have it in the neighbor state in Hungary, in Poland. Next year we will have an election in France. So it's not only an Israeli discussion.
Two more speakers. I do want to remind us that there was an election in Gaza. And the motto at the time, people said, of Hamas was one person, one vote, one time. And that's what happened. In the back, please. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, the first point, I have 2 points. One is just following up from Doron's point, because I don't think Mr. Barmak was sufficiently pushed towards how to prevent this move towards an Orbanite type of structure. I mean, if we, it looks as if the debate you're generating seems to be divorced from a general discussion of what a constitution should look like. Yeah? Even if a country doesn't have a constitution like Britain, there is an evolution of, I think, what you said, basic laws, which are enshrined somehow and gives continuity to something around which society preserves some internal coherence and preservation of values. Yeah? You might easily say, oh, we don't agree on values, but that's exactly why you have an independence, some degree of independence of a judicial arm of the... You say, oh, you can correct that with a supermajority. First of all, that was not the proposal by the government, yeah? Supermajority in the Constitutional Court. But even if you have that, one should prevent an outcome like in the US, where you have a highly politicized Supreme Court, yeah? Where the nomination of the Supreme Judges suddenly starts to swing the whole society back and forth, yeah? So I'm not sure how you really envisage a protection of a structure of a democracy, of a liberal democracy, as it is internationally usually enshrined by separation of powers, because but I want to make a second point, which is, I think, linked to Mr. Snyder had a very endearing presentation of agreeing with everything, yeah? But I want to touch the point about what is Jewish and democracy, yeah? What is, and I do believe there is a certain vision which allows a proper democracy while preserving the one element which actually Jews all over the world thought Israel serves a function, which is a place of refuge. Yeah? But the place of refuge should be limited to those people, Jews, who really need refuge, not really to those people who want necessarily a nice flat or house in Israel on the beach or something. Yeah? So I think it should be a type of asylum system which gives some degree of preference to Jews all over, but it should be like asylum, where you really test whether people are escaping, yeah? For anything else, any other difference in rights of different populations in the state of Israel there is no need for that, yeah? And I think communities, whether you're a Jewish community, of course you have a right of practicing your religion, your ethnicity, etc., as do others, yeah? But I don't see any problem necessarily to have a Jewish democracy if it is limited to that specific element and to nothing beyond that. And I wondered how you stand to that. You mentioned this one point, that people still believe in the necessity of a Jewish majority. Yeah? On the other hand, you said nobody believes in two-state solution. This seems to be inconsistent to me, because either you have a two-state solution, then you might have a preservation of Jewish majority. If you don't think it is a practical outcome, you have to find some other mechanism.
Thank you. Next and last.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. You've proved that this problem is almost insoluble. I'm an American. I'm a Jew. I'm a Democrat. I worked with Jimmy Carter. And at that time, it was a time of great hope. But right now, it isn't. I hate Donald Trump, but I think one of the only, maybe it's the only good thing that he did, in my view, was the Abraham Accords, because it's changed the landscape of the Middle East. So my question, if you're going to give answers to all these questions, my question is, has the Abraham Accords made it better for the Palestinians or worse? Right now, it seems like it's made it worse, that all those countries who signed on or who may sign on to the Abraham Accords are ditching the Palestinians. But maybe in the long run, it may be good for this particular unique problem that the region has. So I'm wondering if anybody has an opinion on that. Thank you for a very interesting discussion.
And thank you for being brief in your question. All right, we actually only have 5 minutes left. So I encourage you to be selective in your responses and not feel compelled to answer every question in full length. We will continue, we will reverse the order now that we began with. So Natan, you're first.
Yeah, I'm totally inconsistent. You're right, and in that sense, I'm a Marxist, Groucho Marx. You know, I have principles. If you don't like them, I have other principles, and I have no problem with that, because yes, I truly believe that there should be one democratic state where Jews and Palestinians should live side by side in equality, and there's no need for a Jewish state. I believe in that. I dream of that. It's an illusion. And I keep up that illusion also because I don't believe that it will ever happen. It's too dangerous for me, in my opinion. That's why I want to keep up the illusion of Jewish state majority. And like I said, you know, there was a vision that Israel should be a state of the Jews, a refuge, as you said, and Jews who are refugees should come. And there's the vision that Israel should be a Jewish state. It's both, and it should be both. And like I said, it's a constant process of negotiation. That's why I want to go away from the concept of true democracy and all that. I think Doron is right, this is a global problem. But I think the specifics of the Israeli problematic are very, how should I put them? Israel is, I mean, people are comparing, you know, we're on the way of becoming Iran, we're on the way of becoming Hungary, we're on the way to becoming Poland, we're on the way of becoming Austria, whatever. And none of that is true. None of that is true. We're on the way of becoming Israel. And these are very specific Israeli problems. That's also why I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but that's why I'm against a constitution. Because I don't want to freeze that process. I want to keep the negotiation going, because you cannot have a constitution in Israel with an Arab population, an Orthodox population, a secular population. You cannot have a constitution where people like Sagi, Orly, and I are considered to be mainstream, and you have people even further to the extremes who are all part of the Israeli collective. I mean, we don't want to live in a world where there are no Orthodox Jews. We don't want to live in a world where there are no people who believe in complete equality between Jews and Palestinians. We don't want to live in that world. They all should have a voice. And because of that reason, you cannot freeze up that act. There was a moment in 48, maybe, when there was a moment when you could have written a constitution. That moment passed, and I don't think it should be now recreated. We should keep up the work and keep up the negotiation, and maybe that's going to lead somewhere.
Thank you. Wally.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I do want to address the possibility of revoking the Palestinian Party's ability to run. It's not a theoretical thing at all. Every elections, in every round of elections in Israel, the Knesset actually does exactly that. Now, today, for the past day, every single elections, the Knesset's committee, the Knesset's election committee actually rules out the Palestinian parties, either as a party or individually. And every single year they need to go to the Supreme Court, and here is why it is very relevant to the Palestinians. And the Supreme Court reverses each time the ruling of the Knesset's committee and allows the Palestinians to participate in the elections. So it's not theoretical at all.
That's why you should come to the demonstrations.
And in that regard, I think that it's very important to remember the article under which the Palestinian parties are being ruled every time is Article 7A in the basic law of the Knesset. That article says that whoever, if you do not accept the nature of Israel, the definition of Israel as Jewish and democratic, you cannot participate in the elections. Basically meaning that the Palestinians should be Zionists to participate in the elections. But historically, this article was put there to actually fight against the Kahanist forces, the fascist forces that were rising in the 80s. And the Jewish state was taken for granted. They added Jewish and democratic so that Kahanist forces, fascist forces, will not be able to run. Today, we are in a situation where Kahana's most prominent disciple is one of the most prominent ministers in our government, and the Palestinians are being persecuted by that article. This is the shift that Israel has been. Can I address the Abraham Accord? It's a disaster from the beginning, and it was just a way to bypass the Palestine. Israel is constantly searching instead of resolving the issue. The issue is we've never had a problem with Saudi Arabia or with Qatar or with we don't have borders with these countries, so a peace agreement is sort of senseless. It doesn't really make. But Israel is constantly trying to find ways to bypass the Palestinian issue, and look where Saudi is now, embracing Iran. So it didn't do Israel that good either. And one last sentence about the constant comparing Israel to Iran and will be Iran. And I'm really sorry to conclude with a very pessimist note, but I wish we were Iran. I always say that I'm more optimistic about the future of Iran than the future of Israel, because the Iranians are searching for a way out, and the Israelis are still preoccupied with justifying the way that leads to a dead end. And so, yeah.
No, exactly. Listen, there is a basic law in Israel, not a regular law, a basic law, which explicitly forbids parties who support terrorism, racism, and parties who deny Israel as the as the state of the Jewish people from running to the Knesset, right? Basic law, which have the support not only of the coalition, major parties in the opposition supports that basic law, an article supposedly of the Constitution. And what the court do? Just ignores it. Now, we can debate the merits of this basic law. Okay, we can have a discussion, but it's a basic law. So you asked about checks and balances. What checks and balances the court? The court is a branch of government. What prevents the court from abusing its power? And the answer in Israel currently is nothing.
What would prevent Israel to become a fascist state?
Public opinion, citizenship. The court will not save you because, don't forget, you could get conservative judges, and then what you will do?
It was not enough in the Weimar Republic.
Hungary has a constitution. Poland has a constitution. In Poland, you have an upper chamber. What is going on in those countries? The US have the most elaborate system of government on earth. Yes? They stormed the Capitol. The court did not prevent it.
I agree with Sagi. The courts won't save us. We're going to save ourselves, and we do it.
That was a very nice concluding statement. Thank you, Nathan. And thank all of you for your patience. I'm sure you agree with me that this was a very lively discussion. And I wish you a pleasant evening.